and it's all good. We need prayer as a part of course, worship and assembling together. Sometimes, like I've been late. No, I've been known to be late a time or two in my life. Sometimes with services, and sometimes our prayer requests are long. So that's good. But I have a lot to cover because there's a lot going on in this lesson, in this outline. So today we're going to look at rejection and how Christ was rejected in his hometown, and we're going to uh, kind of evaluate and analyze um, his rejection and his words to his, um, well, in words to people in the synagogue, the Jews, and then later we will look at, or we will look at what Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 10:44, because I think that's kind of important in some of these matters as well. Uh, so again, there were some thinking questions, some preparation, introductory questions about have you ever been rejected? Um, Never, right? No. When I first met Serena, uh, I was like, wow, she's attractive and she's a very spiritual, faithful young lady at the time. And well, of course, yeah. So, so yeah. Well, and here's the deal: is so I met her, and we were at a Friday night, which was really cool. I mean, some of these congregations up and down the valley, the ministries they have, it was really nice going to Woodward Park, and they had pretty faithful 12 to 18. I know that's a little bit of a gap there, but college age students that would get together on Fridays and Saturday nights to encourage one another instead of us potentially going somewhere else that we probably shouldn't be in, right? Being tempted to go out and hang out with perhaps our worldly acquaintances and friends from college or whatnot. Anyways, I, we're at our buddy's house and we were doing a Devo and eating some dinner and having fun. And there was probably, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 guys there or people there. And Serena was there. And I remember starting to talk to her. And I was going to be straight with her. I was like, hey, look, I've made some bad decisions. I haven't always been an angel. And to this day, and she disagrees, but to this day, the look and the response in her face was the way I saw it was, oh, really? Like, I'm like, okay, that's it. That's glad I got to meet you. We'll talk later. And I don't know, 10 months later, she couldn't withstand my good looks, only surpassed by my winning personality. So, but anyways, have we ever been rejected? How did it make us feel? There's some kind of embarrassment, some vulnerability, probably. Um, and then how do we get over it? How do we get over it? I have a young man in class, high school kids and their little girlfriends or boyfriends or whomever that may be. But he's a young man, and I guess he kind of had his first girlfriend ever, really, and they were only kind of boyfriend and girlfriend. Or I don't know. Today's crazy. Whatever you want to call it, for like 6 8 weeks. But he's still like really crushed because they broke up. And so I'm trying to tell him that's one girl in one high school in one town in one part of California. There's lots of people out there. And so, anyways, he's having a tough time getting over it. So Christ again was rejected, and we're gonna read um two different books, two different accounts, I should say. Uh, in Matthew's account and Mark's account, they are very, very, very similar. In fact, even based upon wordage, they're really, really, really similar. And for me, when I read those passages, there's a bit of not confusion, but there's a bit of questioning, and I'm going to explain why here as we kind of roll into this. But then we're going to spend the most of our time analyzing and going through exegesis of Luke 4. Luke 4. So let's read Mark 6. I'll call on volunteers if we want to do it that way, which is fine. Um, Dan Haley, would you mind reading Mark 6, 1 through 6, please? Okay, thank you. So here in Mark, and by the way, like I said, it's almost verbatim, except that Matthew only has, I believe, 4 or 5 verses, and Mark has 6. My brain, I tell you what, maybe I need this 2 week break coming up pretty quick. And I'm glad I'm done with football. But anyways, it's interesting when you read this, and when I've read this in the past, I go, how do you go from being astonished, right? The later part of verse 2 there. How do you go from being astonished at the man, then all of a sudden they took offense at him? So to me, there was something in between there that I didn't understand. I mean, it's not that I didn't understand, I questioned, right? Well, how do you go from perhaps, and again, this is perhaps an example of where we may need to use additional resources, even kind of original language stuff, to understand really what the mindset of the Jews in the synagogue would have been. Okay, and so that astonished, or marveled, right, in some translations, and we'll see that also, I think, in Luke, maybe should be more interpreted not as amazement on the positive side, but more like astonished by what they said. That's one theory, by the way. And so I read that. I talked to some people. I read some commentary. I don't know. To me, Luke's account is more definitive that there was a swing from, wow, here's here's Jesus. Here's this man we've heard of. Here's this man we've heard of doing great works in Capernaum, and we're going to get to that in a minute. And so I think that it did swing from more of a positive connotation to a negative one, and Luke will explain why, and I'll try to help see that out. Now let's read Luke 6. I'm sorry, Luke 4. Luke 4, 16 through, let's do 16 through 22. Um, Brian Hickson, would you read that? Luke 4, 16 through 22. To 22, please, through 22. All right, Dad, can you read 23 through 31? Yep, that's it. Thank you. So Luke writes this event relatively early, or records this event relatively early in his letter, right? So some scholars believe that Jesus was rejected twice at Nazareth, once at the beginning of his ministry, and then on this occasion. I've never heard of that theory before, And to me, it seems it seems to run contradictory to some degree as to Jesus's instruction to his disciples, the 12, before he sends them out. So I think based upon what happens here, being rejected is in his own hometown, he tells his disciples, and therefore likely, and Roper agrees, or Roper says that likely both Matthew and Luke's account supports Luke's. They're the same one. Luke just adds a little bit more. He gives a little bit more detail to it. The reason why I'm fairly convinced that it only happened once is because if you go back to, and you don't have to turn to it, but Matthew 10 in verse 44, Jesus tells his disciples, wait, I'm in Matthew. Oh, wait. I wrote down the wrong because Matthew 10 doesn't have a 44. What I'm looking for is when Jesus tells his disciples, if you will not be received into someone's home or the town, as a sign to them, dust off your feet. Right. Dust off your feet and leave that house or that town as a sign of them not accepting you and you moving on. In essence, not a judgment per se, but as a statement about your hard-heartedness. You rejected the message of Jesus Christ. So to me, because Jesus says to do those things, it's likely that he would have gone back to the same place he was rejected once. I just wrote it wrong. I knew it was somewhere in there. So Matthew 10:14, whoever does not receive you nor heed your words as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. So I believe that Matthew and Mark's account supports Luke's. Luke just adds a lot more. And there's some significant stuff in Luke's writing, by the way, both Luke and Acts, as to how many times he quotes the Old Testament scriptures. And we're going to see here because Luke records Jesus quoting, paraphrasing from the Old Testament. But in Luke uses, which is interesting because you think about the times that perhaps the translations had to go back, but he uses the Septuagint, remember, and that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay, done roughly 250 BC. Okay, but there's a lot there. Um, they say that Truth for Today commentary says that Matthew and Mark's accounts support Luke's detailed version, and that Luke simply put the occasion in early in his letter to show why Jesus used Capernaum and not Nazareth, his hometown, as his headquarters. Interesting here too. So I'm going to throw out some background theory, but I find this stuff fascinating because I like history. But there is a theory out there that the reason why he chose um, Capernaum is that's because where some believe that Peter resided. So John, however, records that Peter and Andrew and a couple other of the disciples are from Bethsaida. Bethsaida. So again, as you research and dig, not that this is all that big of a deal, but I kind of find it fun that Peter and Andrew would have moved from Bethsaida to Capernaum based upon some tax regulations. Archaeologists are out there searching for Peter's home, and they found a basilica, right, which is a church. It's an octagonal church. The churches made back in the third, fourth, fifth century were octagonal. Literally, their walls were octagonal, and so they believe that they found Peter's home underneath this church in Capernaum. We're not even 100%. Archaeologists and scientists are not even 100% certain as where Bethsaida would have been. I've looked at multiple maps, and some people have it more due north of the Sea of Galilee, and some have it slightly off, closer to Capernaum, more like northwest on the sea. Uh, Part of it has to do with Bethsaida, based upon written tradition, was flooded very, very bad to the point where it was basically underwater. And so archaeologists have dug due north near the Jordan River, but all this is based upon who I think he was a, I don't know if he was Catholic or if he was Greek or Orthodox or what, but in 1921, a person went out there and kind of, my understanding is flipped the religious world. Not flipped it, but for 1700 years we believed, Christian tradition believed that Peter was from Bethsaida, and he said, "Oh no, there's a mistake. He's from Capernaum." All right, I'm getting that really doesn't matter. But here's what's interesting: Nazareth was approximately 20 to 30 miles from Capernaum, and by the way, Bethsaida, wherever that was from Capernaum, would have only been a handful of miles, 3 to 5 miles, if that. Yes. Oh yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, that's true. Right. And so, why is that significant? I basically, let me try to give some application to it, because a lot of Jesus' adult life was spent in Capernaum. A lot of it. And so, why Capernaum? That's kind of the question I ran into and didn't explain very well my findings. Um, but Roper also says it could be true that Jesus was rejected twice on two different instances. I don't think the scriptures support that. I think it's just one. I've never heard of the two theory, by the way. Um, Nevertheless, Nazareth was probably his first stop on his third tour of Galilee. Okay, making that circuit, so to speak. In Luke 4:16, I'm going to try to do this verse by verse. I think that's kind of the best way to do it here. But in Luke 4, immediately we're hit with something that should be reflective in nature. It says, "And Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he'd entered the synagogue on the Sabbath." I'm going to stop right there. As was his custom. Here's God in the flesh, who still thought it important enough that on a very regular basis, depending on how you want to interpret his custom, worship God the Father. If Jesus is worshiping God the Father, how much more so should we make sure we're here worshiping God the Father? And not just here, but every day of the week. When you read that, I mean, so many times I've read that, but I just kind of glossed over it, right? But Jesus would regularly go into the synagogues to worship the Father. We need to make a habit of doing that as well. And he stood up to read. He stood up to read. So the way a synagogue service would have gone, or the way it would have been performed, was there would have been a reciting of the Shema, the Shema. This is found in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. There would have been several prayers offered. They would not have, well, they could have been, personal prayers like we do sometimes with prayer requests, but likely these were traditional recited prayers done regularly, perhaps at least once a month. So that's the idea. It was very structured. And then around this time, and we don't know for sure, historians and scholars can't quite put the exact date on it, but it's around the first, into the second or third century, that Jewish synagogue practices on the Sabbath would have been very, very, very structured, to the point where when you were given the law and the prophets, there would have been a specific set of words, a specific set of statements that you would have read out of that. It was that scheduled, kind of like what we're trying to do here. On this Sunday and this Wednesday, we want to cover this. On this Sunday and that Sunday, we want to cover this. So, how does that maybe affect our understanding? Well, Jesus, as we read, Jesus opened the scrolls and found the place he wanted to read. So, I think regardless if it was so structured that the attendant here, the officer of the synagogue, when he gave him the scrolls, I believe either way that there's divine providence, right? Jesus always, again and again, and he says that here when he quotes from Isaiah about being in the Spirit. Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And so it's amazing that he's to open up the scrolls and read exactly what this group of people need to hear and exactly what God wanted him to hear. So a portion of the law would have been read after the reciting of the Shema and the prayers, and then there would have been a reading of the prophets. And again, there wasn't because scholars again kind of disagree as to when all this may have started. Um, it sounds like not maybe every Sabbath some of the prophets were read, but when they had organized it in a much more deliberate and actual planned out, it was a 3-year cycle. So you would read through exactly what they wanted on this Sabbath, and then every 3 years you started over again. It was rather kind of interesting when I looked into that. So Jesus gets up. He stood up to read. It was very custom in the Jewish synagogues that you would stand up to read the law and the prophets. It was not permissible or lawful for you to sit down and read the law of the prophets. You could teach and actually preach and give exposition, okay, or do expository preaching based upon what was read sitting down and general discussions and prayers. But to read the law and the prophets, you had to stand up. And by the way, I'm going to turn my back so we understand. So the scrolls would have been rolled out this direction, not, we see movies, right? And it's done like this. Especially, I just think of Shrek, right? Because there's always, they always read the scrolls like this. But they would have read it like this, and actually in Hebrew, and I am not a Hebrew scholar by any means, and here's the reason why, is because in Hebrew you read from left to right. And I can barely read from right to left. I'm not even going to try to. So you would roll the scrolls literally. You would roll the scrolls this way, right, and keep opening it up. No, it went right to left. Right. So you read from here. So you would roll this. Yeah. Anyways, I'll stop dancing. I hope this is not on the camera. So he stands up to read, and then he sits back down. The book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. I'm in verse 17. And he opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." There's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and do it right now. I'm gonna underline me in all the places in 18 that he says it, and then I'm also gonna underline release because it says release at least once. And some translations in early manuscripts have release twice, and that's significant. I'll explain why. The me is confirming what the prophet Isaiah said, who was the anointed one. He says it 3 times. Really, that's a lot. And then in early manuscripts, the release, I'm looking to make sure I'm not, is actually said twice. Release from what? Right? Well, release of those who were oppressed, those who were on the fringes. This would have been a small handful of Israelites, true, but also pointing towards the Gentiles. Furthermore, um, pointing to the law. Release from the requirements of the law. He's trying to foretell or explain to them that I am he who is talked about in Isaiah. I am he who's talking about Isaiah. We'll get to that. Here we go. And again, the to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, that's significant too. And Wayne does a good job of trying to connect this. And when you really study this stuff, there is so much connection between the words of Jesus, the gospel writers, as well as Paul's letters a lot of times, especially to Romans and some other people, connecting what Jesus did and the prophecies to what's being fulfilled or had been fulfilled. So it's very significant. Let's see. I got a little ahead of myself. Again, he started rolling it from left to right. I said that there were no verses or divisions, right? There would have been no numbers or chapters. Yes. I was trying to clarify that. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. Some translations use the word found. Let's see if I'm reading out of the New American Standard. So we're going to jump back here real quick. Yeah, see, the New American Standard in the latter part of 17 does not say found. Some of your translations do, right? New King James does. Oh, no, mine does. I'm sorry. And found the place where it was written. So there again, scholars are debating whether he knew what he wanted to read, he knew the will of the Father, and he was going to read something specific, or if by divine providence, of course, Jesus is God and he's got the Spirit of God living in him, that he just happened to be there on the right day. Either way, he read what Nazareth needed to hear. Because he was about to give a lot of information here. Yes. Mm, right. And that could be. Like I said, in my readings and my studies, and I find this stuff fascinating. You can ask Serena. I was in the back room just reading until like 11 o'clock last night almost. I love the history. The archaeology is to me is also amazing. But yes, there's two different thoughts. We know for sure that around late third century, which would be like 275, 285, and certainly into the fourth century, that the way the synagogue practices would have been very, very, very explicit and detailed. If Dustin was going to come up and read, he was going to read the 12 verses, right? They didn't have verses, but he was going to read the 12 lines or whatever that the synagogue ruler would have prescribed that day. He didn't have any option to do anything else. So it's hard to say for sure. Either way, I think there's divine providence and all that kind of good stuff going on there. So good question. Um, Men, okay, I said that men stood up to read and sat to teach. Christ was ready to explain what he just read. There was no mistaking who these verses were referring to in Scripture, the Christ. Note in Luke 4:20 and 4:20, all and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. So that all is definitive. It's not hyperbole, right? It's actually all the eyes of the individuals in the synagogue were on him. Because remember, again, connecting here to Old Testament, during this time and leading up to this time for centuries, the Israelites were still waiting on the Messiah. You had the remnant still waiting, those oppressed, right? Those slaves, they were still widows and orphans. They were still waiting for the Messiah. So they're getting excited. Jesus just read this. He read what we want to hear. All the eyes were fixed on him. There was something, again, special to those in the synagogue at that moment to what he had just read. Then he goes on to say in verse 21, and he began to say to them, "Today the scripture is being fulfilled in your hearing." A big deal. Re- Remember, I went back and I underlined in 18 and 19 all the times he said me. He says it 3 times in one verse. And then in another verse and a half in the earliest manuscripts, he says release twice. Big, big, big deal. Okay, to how the synagogue should have understood who Jesus was and what he was reading. Verse 22, and all were speaking well of him. I'm reading out of the New American Standard. I got 2 ESVs too, but couldn't find them as I rushed out the door. And all were speaking well of him and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. And they were saying, "Is this not Joseph's son?" Okay, so again, there's some debate. There's some debate as to whether the people who are questioning Jesus and what he's saying, and not just what he's saying, but who he is in general. So some people think that this is a negative statement. Like, who are you? Right? You're Joseph's son, you're a carpenter. the additional resources which I read, and by the way, if you don't have access to this, we can give you the website and the password. This is really good stuff. Found this online. Um, I like this a lot. I'll read over Roper stuff, and then I go right to here. There's quite a bit of meat in here. There really is. Yes, Wayne. Right, of course. Right. And again, in my research, that's what kind of keeps me going. To be honest with you, when I don't find definitive answers, I'm like, oh, we got to look at something else. I just like that's me. I'm analytical and yeah, I just enjoy that part of it. While Serena's trying to wrestle 4 kids and a puppy, I'm back there doing that. But this had a lot to say. This and to me it clarified a lot. So I believe based upon what Jesus said and what he's beginning to say, because they're excited. Remember, they're looking for the Messiah. Perhaps this is the guy. And for a brief moment, a lot of scholars believe that many in the synagogue, if not all of them, were like, he's finally here. It's not until he explains some things based upon his understanding of the mindset and attitude of the people in the synagogue that then they turn quick. They turn so quick that they basically want to kill him. They want to run him off the cliff. Okay, so and again, we're going to get to this as we go through here. I believe that they were fixated on him. They were excited. They did speak well of him, and they were listening to his gracious words, stuff from Isaiah. And then they say, "Is this not Joseph's son?" I again remember who the Messiah was supposed to be in the Jewish mind. We remember that, right? We went over it. I went over it for sure when I taught almost a year ago. They're looking for someone big, powerful, global leader, reestablish Israel and Jerusalem, right? They're looking for the guy. In their mind, the guy, right? The greatest of the greatest of Jews. Far greater than Paul could have ever been. Because Paul calls himself, right? A great Jew, basically. And so they're like, man, this humble individual, could this be him? He's going to reestablish? Not so fast, right? And we know that. Is this not Joseph's son? And he said to them, I'm in 23 now. No doubt you will quote this proverb to me. Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we heard was done in Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well. So it's understood that the people in the synagogue weren't actually stating this. He knew their intentions. He knew their thoughts and their hearts. And being that Jesus was from Nazareth, they're expecting special privilege. They're expecting, to be healed and blessed. Because after all, Jesus, this is where you were from. This is where you were birthed. This is where you spent significant time. Physician, heal yourself. Physician, heal yourself. No doubt, excuse me, I just read that. Normally, this meant take care of your own problems before you try to solve ours. Take care of your own problems before you try to solve ours. However, here, based on all the miracles that we heard were done in Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well, it means prove you are the physician by doing miracles here as you have in Capernaum. So again, their unbelief is starting to unravel a little bit. They've started to question based upon something that was going on. So again, it's interesting to see how based upon the way Jesus looked and based upon their understanding that this is Joseph's son, just a carpenter, and in their mind who they're expecting the Messiah to be, they're starting to doubt strongly, is what scholars believe. Because again, Roper put in here in the outline, which is kind of funny, and we don't know, it's all speculation, but he says, we can only imagine some of their comments or their thoughts in their brain in the synagogue about Jesus. I have furniture made by him, right? He repaired some of my equipment. This isn't the individual who we're imagining, who we're thinking. And if you are physician, heal yourself. Not literally heal yourself, but heal where you came from. Bless where you came from. This is Jesus of Nazareth. Do these things. Prove it over and over and over. Which is interesting because Jesus, how many times does Jesus quote? Well, I know he quotes it at least once. But he says it's the wicked generation who desires or commands signs and wonders. Wayne did a good job of pointing this out a while back, a few weeks ago at least, about Jesus doesn't do commands or miracles, right? Excuse me, based upon someone's command or saying, "Show me a sign and then I'll believe," type stuff. Because in reality, that's not belief. That's not faith, right? Faith comes. Faith is the hope of things unseen. Yes. Right. And by the way, and that's a good illustration, it really is. But by the way, this is the Son of Man. This is God in the flesh. And by their own words, or at least by their own thoughts, Jesus knew their thoughts, they knew what he was doing in Capernaum. They knew the things he was doing was legit signs and wonders, confirming the word and the message about who he really was. Matthew and Mark. So Matthew and Mark's accounts simply tell us there was a problem, and the problem was their unbelief. Luke really explains it a lot better as we try to, and that's the thing, we have to dissect. If you have the Bible like it, we have to dissect the words in red. Brian, you had something? Right, right. You would think. In fact, Wayne was teaching us a couple weeks ago, and I was going to make a comment, but I don't want to. I don't ever want to get sidetracked or hijack a class or But it's simply amazing to me, and perhaps that's when we go back and we look at the word marveled, right, or we're bewildered, so to speak. It's simply amazing, and I don't use that in the positive way. That Jesus does all these things, and yet people still don't believe. And the more I think I understand it, it's based upon, and Wayne kind of hit this 2 3 weeks ago. It's based upon kind of his background, who he was. He's simply a carpenter's son. Look at his hands. He works for a living. We can't judge a book by its cover, because that's in essence what the Israelites were doing, and that's Jesus knows that that is what they're doing right now in their hearts and their minds. So absolutely, shouldn't it be enough? Oh sure, yeah sure, right. Again, Jesus says, "How much more blessed are those that believe and do not see." Specifically, when he talks to Thomas, by the way, doubting Thomas. But today, it blows our minds when we read some of the Old Testament, some of the New Testament, especially the New Testament, and we don't see Jesus' miracles. We simply read about them, right? And how in our minds we go, "How in the world?" I mean, we read it and we believe in our hearts, but they saw it. They witnessed it. They saw the individual who was lame and could never have walked on the mat, and he gets up and walks away. How do these people? And again, it goes to their hearts and minds. It goes to how hard their heart and mind was, wanting the power, what they thought was important in their own glory. We need to finish, which we will. I'm going to tease this because I know some of us won't be here simply because we live far away. We got stuff going on. But even though I'm going to tease this, you still got to come back because we on Wednesday as we clarify this. The reason why they get upset. Here's the reason why they get upset and they want to run Jesus off the cliff. Is because Jesus tells two stories. They're true stories based upon Scripture about how in the days of Elijah it didn't rain by God's will and God's power. It was a sign and wonder. It was miraculous. Did not rain for 3.5 years. And in all that time, there were many Israelites, many Jewish individuals who were suffering and hurting. Now, the reason why Jesus closed the heavens and there was no rain was a judgment decision based upon Israel's sin. So he cast a judgment on them and he prevented it to rain for 3.5 years. But during that time, there's many Israelites that suffered. No one, no one of the nations of Israel, the tribes of Israel, were ever healed or cleansed or blessed. But two different non-believing, non-Israelite people were. They use the term Gentile. I forget the Old Testament term that's used in common, pagan, idolaters, those who did some pretty the worship of Baals. Two of them were healed, and Jesus basically says in a nutshell who these Jews in the synagogue, who were first amazed, now they're going to get their toes stepped on. And for us, a lot of times, hopefully, if we get our toes stepped on, I know I'm over. We just kind of, you know, process it and reflect and go, maybe he's right. But Jesus basically says he loves God. God loves the Gentiles more than he loves the Jews, based upon their hardness of heart and their sin, the Jewish leaders. Hey, I'm way over. Um, thanks for being present. Good questions. And we'll dissect this a little bit more on Wednesday.